So I thought we'd begin with a brief description from James Boyce on this book, The Founding of Melbourne and the Conquest of Australia, that Kate brought to the conversation this morning, called 1835. And right at the beginning of this book, he describes something of what Victoria was like around about the times of first contact between European peoples and Indigenous people. I thought, well, why don't we just start there and get a sense of the earliest times, because most of the actual documented history we have comes from around about 1835 onwards. A lot of undocumented, fairly sketchy oral tradition is around prior to that, and we can hazard some guesses about what was going on, but most of the actual documented history comes from around about that time. So I think you recommend this, don't you, Kate? It's a pretty good read.
Good book. Yeah, I actually first heard someone on ABC radio talking about it, which is why I went off and got it, because it's really comprehensive and it's based on actual documents rather than, as you said, the oral history. That's particularly about what they call the conquest of Victoria. So it's kind of the frontier, if you like, invasion. There's so many different terms for what happened in Victoria because it wasn't officially under British law, it wasn't legal.
Yeah.
Which is why that book's so significant, because you see all the documents and letters that were between officials.
Yeah, fascinating. So, and he begins in this first little piece to just sort of try and sketch the backdrop a bit, and it's necessarily broad and descriptive, and a little bit speculative, I guess. So settle in and enjoy being read to. But if you have some questions, write them down or interrupt and ask the question. That's fine as well. About 40 million years ago, volcanoes began erupting in what is now Victoria. As Tim Flannery recounts, in time the resulting basalt rock would break down to form the largest area of rich soils in Australia and one of the continent's most productive regions. The lava flow and the basalt plains were concentrated in the west, with the Yarra River sitting astride the soil divide. Under Aboriginal land management, through what has become known as fire stick farming, much of the country to the west and north of Melbourne became open grassland. It was these hunting grounds that would eventually be the focus of British ambitions, although equally characteristic of the lower Yarra were the oft-forgotten swamps. I just need to pause there and say that Bruce Pascoe, in a book over there that I'll show you in a moment called Dark Emu, explodes the idea that these open plains were hunting grounds. In fact, it's become very evident through a number of streams of evidence that these open grasslands were actually used and cultivated as crops for the harvesting of grain. And in fact, I think Pascoe details the earliest known evidence of bread baking in Indigenous culture, earlier even than the Egyptian and Mesopotamian cultures.
Generally, the people who are transient because they can't live.
Right, they've got to follow.
Where they are, they've got to go from place to place to survive.
But he even explodes, Bruce Pascoe even explodes some of that. So there are actually settlements.
Yeah.
There were actually there's documentation now of Aboriginal settlements, and there were some seasonal settlements.
Yes.
They weren't just hunter-gatherer people.
Yeah.
They actually had communities and buildings.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Victoria wasn't a place you had to leave to survive.
Right. Yeah. So there may have been some movement within Wurundjeri
There's a
land. I
country
mean, we
line.
know that the Wurundjeri used to move between the upper Yarra and the lower Yarra, depending on where the food was. But they were all contained within their particular space, and they were very, very adept and advanced in their technology around food production and maintenance. So widespread were these wetlands that Flannery imagines Melbourne in 1830 as a sort of temperate Kakadu. Kakadoo's right up in the northern part of Australia, a very rich, fertile place. The heart of the lakes, marshlands and billabongs was the Yarra River, but it was a radically different watercourse from the one bearing that name today, which from the present-day Botanic Gardens to Port Phillip Bay now flows through an almost totally artificial channel. The river was tidal up to a rocky basalt ledge where Queen's Bridge now stands, at which point it was as much as 90 metres wide. It's hard to imagine the Yarra like that now, isn't it? What the British would call the falls acted as a barrier to the saline tidal flows, ensuring that upstream of the rocks could be found a permanent source of fresh water. This natural bridge where salt water met fresh was also where geology and botany divided in an apex of ecological encounter. Within an easy walk could be found grasslands, various woodlands, as well as in almost every direction, mud. On the northern side of the river, stretching 3 kilometres to the northwest, was a wide expanse of flat, boggy land, greater than 1,000 acres in extent. In the middle of this was a permanent lagoon, which one early settler recalled as a beautiful blue lake, intensely blue, nearly oval and full of the clearest salt water, but this by no means deep. On the southern side of the Yarra, between the river and the edge of the bay, swampy land stretched for about 6.5 kilometres and included a number of permanent lagoons, including what was to become, with more than a little taming, Albert Park Lake. There were also extensive lagoons in the region of what is now Port Melbourne. By contrast, much of today's central business district was well-drained grasslands, framed by gentle and lightly wooded hills such as Batman's Hill, where Southern Cross Station now stands, and the pastoral plains stretched far to the north and west. Of all Australia's major cities, the natural environment of Melbourne before British settlement is perhaps the most difficult now to imagine. This is in part a product of the city's size and flat topography, but it also reflects the extent to which the region was dominated by swamps and grasslands, the two ecosystems that were most comprehensively transformed by conquest. It's the same down in Gippsland. We were talking to Cheryl actually about where Wurundjeri land finishes and Kurnai land begins, because there's all of these kind of oral traditions floating around down in Gippsland that, it's disputed country, and we thought that where our place is in Nilma North, that was disputed territory between Kurnai and Wurundjeri. And Cheryl said, no, it's ridiculous to think that. All you have to do is remember what the land was like before white settlement. And all of the land from where around about where Druin is now, back westward as far as probably Pakenham now, was swamp. It was actually impassable swamp. The only way to get around it was to go along the beach or to go up through the mountains and down. We heard Cheryl talking last week about the trails that came down through the mountains into Gippsland. And she said that was the land that divided the Wurundjeri people and the Kurnai people. It was a natural... And I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard and talked about landscape as being profoundly important in Indigenous identity. But just hearing that from Cheryl was another reminder that if you want to know something about Indigenous people and their culture and spirituality, the place you go is to the earth, the land, the environment within which they live, because they were very responsive to and grounded in their environment. But swamp was, very much, because it's all mostly drained now. And that's a great segue to the next little bit. The draining of wetlands has been a Northern European obsession for centuries. The ordered agricultural lands of England's East Anglia region, for instance, are so different from the lost wilderness they replaced, where the people once roamed almost as freely as the animals, that cultural memory has been unable to retain a picture of the vanished landscape, even though the most intense drainage occurred only in the 19th century. At the time of Melbourne's founding, the focus of Australian farming had shifted from cropping to sheep, and most of the wetlands were left alone for 20 years, allowing them to fulfil to some extent their ancient British purpose of providing a refuge for the landless and the poor. However, once property speculation began in earnest, the marshes were drained with ruthless efficiency, and only very pale reflections of their lost splendour now remain. Even more difficult to imagine are the vanished grasslands. Here, language misleads. The native grassland of the Melbourne region was as different from contemporary pastureland as an old-growth forest is from a tree plantation. Port Phillip's once vast temperate grasslands have almost completely vanished, with the remnant pockets that survive able to support only a fraction of the original ecological diversity. The extinct pasture abounded in diverse herbs, flowers and orchids as well as grasses. According to Gary Presland in his revealing history, A Place for a Village, How Nature Has Shaped the City of Melbourne, the plant communities of the grasslands close to Merry Creek alone contained at least 156 species, including 31 different grass species, 24 species of rush or sedge, and a wide range of herbaceous species. Although it is often assumed that British settlers couldn't appreciate the Australian landscape, almost all visitors were astounded by the beauty and wealth of these grasslands. The 1836 observations of John Norcock, an officer on HMAS Rattlesnake, great name, the vessel that transported the first government officials from Sydney to Port Phillip, are typical. Quote, "The country here is enchantingly beautiful, extensive, rich plains, all round with gently sloping hills in the distance, all thinly wooded and having the appearance of an immense park. The grasses, flowers and herbs that cover the plains are of every variety that can be imagined and present a lovely picture of what is evidently intended by nature to be one of the richest pastoral countries in the world." And there you hear an implicit judgment. Intended by nature. And that completely bypasses the evidence that was before their eyes that these pastures had been manufactured using agricultural technology by the Indigenous peoples.
And that it was intended for white settlement.
Right, yeah, it was waiting there. God put it there ready for white people to come and exploit. Yeah.
That actual notion is expressly written down and quoted in Bruce Pascoe's book by various people saying this is what God has given us.
Yeah, if you haven't read this, and I'm still making my way through it, Dark Emu, Aboriginal Australia and the Birth of Agriculture. It's the kind of book that every Australian person, no matter what your cultural background, should read.
It's a very easy read in terms of language, turn of phrase. It can be emotionally taxing because it's joyful and it's also shocking. It's joyful because you see how amazing things were before we all arrived.
Okay, we're nearly done with this reading, but I'll just push through because it's just important to sort of take us back, to right to the earliest observations, albeit observations of European people. The fauna too was magnificently diverse, especially the bird life. One early observer listed more than 180 bird species within a 1 mile radius of Melbourne, including the ground birds of the open grasslands such as the emu, Australian bustard, plains wanderer and brush turkey. The wetlands provided the richest concentration, including swans, ducks, brolgas, magpie geese, Cape Barren geese and over 20 migratory species. There were also at least 20 species of fish in the rivers, creeks and marshes, including 2 types of eel. The Aborigines gathered annually to harvest the short-finned eel, which each year moved up the rivers and creeks into the Yarra wetlands, eventually migrating downstream again on sexual maturity, beginning an extraordinary journey to the Coral Sea to breed and die. In places, the Aborigines devised earthworks and stoneworks to catch the well-travelled eels, constructions which, as Geoffrey Blaney notes, when we think of their simple equipment, quite take the breath away. And that's what Bruce Pascoe goes into in detail. The so-called founder of Melbourne, inverted commas, John Batman, observed such eel traps in creeks near Melbourne on his first visit in 1835. The walls were built of stones about 4 feet high and well done and well planned out, 2 or 3 of these places following each other down the stream with gates to them. Good eating river blackfish and bream were abundant in the waterways, as were the local yabby and the Yarra spiny crayfish. As Breslin points out, the creek valleys were also human transport corridors, traversing ecological and political boundaries, a role he observes they have to some extent maintained, with highways and railways often constructed over these creek beds. The Moonee Ponds Creek Valley, along which much of the Tullamarine Freeway now runs, was a major highway to the north, particularly to Mount William, where greenstone was mined and used in making hatchet heads. Given its rich soils, abundant water and diverse food, it is not surprising that the area around Port Phillip was one of the more heavily populated regions of Australia, although it is likely that by 1835 the population had already been reduced by introduced disease. There were 2 groups whose territories directly bordered Port Phillip Bay. On the western side were the Watha Warung, whose lands stretched from the Otway Ranges to the Werribee River. To the east of the Mornington Peninsula, the area around Western Port and the southern Dandenongs was the home of the Boonwurrung-speaking people. The Woiwurrung homeland composed the area drained by the Yarra River and its tributaries. 2 other peoples, the Dongwurrung and the Jadawurrung, whose territory was to the north of Port Phillip Bay, completed the Kulin Federation, which shared language and cultural ties. Within Kulin country, what is now central Melbourne, was a hub of meetings and movement. The basalt ledge, Queen's Bridge, provided a convenient crossing point to diverse ecological regions that contained seasonal food supplies capable of feeding large gatherings of people. Many of the creek highways meandered their way to the Yarra, and what better place for different language groups to meet for ceremony and business than in the bounteous grass next to the large pond where the fresh water began. In 1835, the British did not chance upon an unknown place. The advantages of the Melbourne region had been known for millennia. John Batman and the other would-be founders of Melbourne merely recognised what had long been obvious. This was a place where Homo sapiens might thrive, and indeed had thriven for many, many thousands of years. What are your responses to that very brief depiction of the area around Melbourne in 1835 that had already been impacted by colonial invasion for around about 30 years prior to that?
Fills me with grief. Not solely for the lost lifestyle of Aboriginal people, but for the land as well. It's just such a graphic indicator of what land has to cope with now, and the animals that we know have to cope with now. Just fills me with grief.
We were chatting the other day about how, or Kate was observing how rare it is these days to see anyone building a house that's responsive to the way the sun moves and to the climate around it. You know, we talk about climate passive houses. They're pretty rare. We still seem to just sort of build regardless of our environment. What strikes me about what you just said and what we've read there is that there's a profound difference between colonial culture and the cultures that preceded colonisation. The cultures that preceded colonisation, whilst they did manipulate the environment, evidently, using technology, it was in a way that was using the environment. Oh, you're right, mate? Oh, yeah. Just put that chair over there by the door and I'll make sure it
Maybe on its
is
side.
yeah, put it on its side. Are you all right, Alan?
I'm okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thank God.
For those who didn't see that, we just had a chair malfunction.
Maybe put it on its side.
Chair
Yeah. Yes, speaking about technology.
I have a video at home, a DVD at home, of an elder in Queensland who was teaching some of the young boys about fire management.
Mm.
And he goes into the bush and he's talking on camera as he goes into the bush, and he's talking about how people these days use hot fires to manage country.
Mm.
Everything's a hot fire. He says you don't need hot fire, it's better to do a cool fire.
Mm.
And he goes into an area in the bush and he bends down to the ground and he looks, and there's been fire that he's just put through it while he's been teaching these kids.
Mm.
So it's all the undergrowth is black. And he bends down to the ground and there's a stalk of grass sticking up like that. He puts his finger on it and all these ants run onto his hand. And he says, see,
Mm.
nothing gets hurt.
Yeah, right.
You have a cool fire and the animals can find somewhere to go away from that fire, and then they come back and they're not hurt.
Mm.
So we manage the land and the animals as well. And it brought me to tears watching that.
Yeah.
It's just so simple and so beautiful
Mm.
to see this old man, you know, with his hand down and the ants just
Mm.
piling up.
So it describes this kind of beautiful balance, doesn't it, between managing, in that sense, yep, using technology to manipulate the environment to make sure it's productive and sustaining of life, but in a way that's responsive to the environment as well and recognises our reliance on a healthy environment. And that's what seems to be missing in a post-industrialist Western worldview. That is that we assert ourselves relentlessly on the environment. Yeah.
And I think it's descriptive of a worldview that is very acquisitive.
Yeah.
So it's kind of
Yeah.
acquiring. So when you go back to your example about the houses,
Mm.
you can build houses that are in conversation and connection with land and environment.
Mm.
You can build houses that acquire the land. I want the tall spot because I want to have the view.
Mm.
I want to get rid of the trees so I have the view. And you know, it's an acquisitive process, and the whole evasion of Victoria is acquisitive. You know, the land grab.
Mm.
It's constant acquiring more and gathering more because that's where people tend to think their comfort and security is coming from.
Yeah.
Will come from.
Yeah. We'll keep moving because time. I think we're way over prepared for today, but and I want us to get to this episode of First Australians. But you heard James Boyce there talk about the impact of disease that reduced Indigenous population massively. We know that it wasn't only disease; it was also violence, sometimes brutal massacres, sometimes open combat between colonists and Indigenous communities. But there was a lot of violence in those days. And one of the stories that emerges from Gippsland that we touched on last week with Cheryl was the story of the Macmillan family, who Macmillan was an early explorer of the Gippsland area, who is now known to have used brutal violence against the Kurnai people. And I just want to clarify again that often you'll hear the Gippsland people referred to as the Gurnai people, or the Gurnai people, Gunai Kurnai people. What's coming to light now is in fact that Gunai is not the appropriate name of those people. It's the Kurnai people, and always has been. Gunai simply means another black fella from another area who might happen to be visiting at the time. So classic confusion of language and terminology amongst colonial discourse and so on. I came across this article written by the great niece of Macmillan, who discovers her family history. And I thought I'd read it to you because it doesn't only sort of unfold some of the story of Macmillan, but also what it means now, today, to deal with the generations of trauma and abuse that are still ours, in a sense. You know, we hold this stuff in us. So her name is Cal Flynn, and I'll read this. And here's a picture of Macmillan rather paternalistically holding the hand of a local Indigenous man.
In Bruce Pascoe's book, Chris,
Yeah.
he talks about this picture
Uh-huh.
and about Macmillan actually sitting on, there's stories, oral history about him sitting on something higher to make himself bigger and taller.
Right.
But in fact, he was quite a small fellow.
Yeah, okay.
A lot smaller than his companions then.
So I'll read this, and if you're anything like me, it'll strike you as a profound reflection by a young woman. It's called "My Relative Was a Mass Murderer of Australia's Gunai People. Can I Make Amends?" In 2011, I made an uncomfortable discovery about my family history. I had a famous great-great-great-uncle, I learned, Angus Macmillan. He was an explorer of early Australia, but in recent years he has also been identified as the man responsible for a series of massacres of the Gunai, sometimes referred to as the Gunai-Kurnai, people of Gippsland in the southeastern state of Victoria. I'm going to refer to them as Kurnai from now on, even though it's written as Gunai in here. These attacks were cold-blooded and without mercy. Men with guns descended upon unsuspecting encampments, killing men, women and children. They were killed, as one settler wrote later, whenever the Kurnai can be met with. In the first 10 years of settlement in Gippsland, the Kurnai population fell by more than 90% to little more than 100 individuals. Macmillan had fled Scotland during the time of the Highland clearances, but in a cruel irony, he went on to enact brutal clearances of his own upon his new country, the worst at Warrigal Creek in 1843, where 80 to 200 members of the Bratwalong clan were killed in revenge for the murder of a single white settler. What struck me when I read that about his history was that he has come out of the context of abusive and traumatic land clearance and now perpetuates the same upon others. And that's something that we've learnt that often occurs in the context of traumatised individuals. I wouldn't begin to suggest that that was the only reason why Macmillan was behaving the way he did. I'm sure there was a pretty good portion of colonial acquisitiveness in there as well. But it's part of the story, isn't it? My relative has come to embody some of the very worst excesses of Australian colonial history, and that is saying a lot for a country in which 20,000 of its Indigenous people are estimated to have died during the frontier wars, and where, until relatively recent history, tens of thousands of Aboriginal children were separated forcibly from their families and rehomed in orphanages or with white foster families. On Thursday, Australia will celebrate, although celebrate is perhaps the wrong word, an occasion known as National Sorry Day. This annual event is held as a gesture of apology to the Aboriginal population for the havoc wreaked upon their people by colonialism. In previous years, it has been marked by people marching through the streets or by distributing black roses. Flags are lowered to half-mast, while above cloud-written apologies are writ large across the sky. Sorry. There is much to be sorry for. Learning of my link to this disturbing chapter in our colonial history left me in a state of shock. I knew there had been some awful injustices in British colonies, but to find such a vivid example in my own family tree was something else entirely. Since 2011, investigating this grisly episode has become a growing preoccupation and one that finally drove me to travel to the other side of the world. I wanted to uncover the truth of Macmillan's actions and to meet face to face the Indigenous group who suffered at his hands. I've now visited Gippsland 3 times, and there I met local historians, Kurnai elders, and those who work for the benefit of that community. The conversations we've had have required me to listen and be humble. They have not always been easy, for the story of Macmillan and what came after him is not a pleasant one. Like many Indigenous peoples, the Kurnai community today struggles with problems of addiction and violence, what some might call diseases of despair. In many ways, the overt violence of Macmillan and his men did not have the worst impact. That came from the policies of assimilation that were later enacted upon the much weakened survivors, confined to Christian missions, the banning of traditional customs, the breaking apart of families, and other misguided attempts to civilise a culture that had predated the settlers by tens of thousands of years. Mile Creek. Here in 1838, a crime that would not be forgotten took place. I'm not sure how that fits into the dialogue, but anyway, there might have been an image there, I think, that's missing. For Australia's Indigenous people, deep social problems arrived with the settlers and never departed. Life expectancy for this group is still 10 years lower than the Australian average, and the unemployment rate is 3 times higher. Indigenous children are 10 times more likely to be taken into care and 30 times more likely to suffer from malnutrition. Indigenous individuals are 15 times more likely to be imprisoned, 8 times more likely to die from alcohol-related causes, and more than twice as likely to commit suicide. They also suffer from endemic levels of racism. A 2012 survey of Indigenous people in Victoria found that 97% of respondents had been targets of verbal or physical abuse or discrimination over the previous year. 84% had been verbally abused. 67% had been spat at or had objects thrown at them. 66% told that they did not belong in their hometowns, and 70% had suffered 8 or more incidents over that single year. With these statistics at the forefront of my mind, I was staggered by the gracious welcome I received from the Kurnai community, many of whom were generous enough not only to meet me to discuss in great depth the human consequences of Macmillan and his peers' actions and the longer-term consequences. Ricky Mullet, for example, now the Chief Executive of the Kurnai Land and Waters Corporation, the body set up to manage what has been accepted by the court to be the Kurnai people's native territory, took me to a number of sites where massacres took place before putting me up at his own home. I can only hope my efforts have made a small contribution to repairing old damage. I have written a book, Thicker Than Water, about my experience in the hope of furthering awareness and understanding of these dark historical secrets. For despite the advent of National Sorry Day, the native title legislation that returned ownership of land to the Kurnai, and the admission of collective guilt and responsibility they imply, there is still a vocal segment of Australian society that makes great efforts to downplay the significance and impact of frontier violence and assimilation policies, and denies the obligation of today's generation to accept blame for the behaviour of their predecessors. A great many of our political conversations today seem to revolve around such questions of collective colonial guilt. Should reparations be paid to the descendants of slaves? Should the British Museum return its ill-gotten gains? Must roads fall? In Gippsland, an analogous discussion is underway. Russell Broadbent, the Liberal MP for the Macmillan electorate in Victoria, has asked the Australian Electoral Commission to rename his seat, and it's something that's just actually taken place.
Sadly, they didn't take on the recommended Indigenous name. They gave it Monash instead.
Yeah.
There was a recommendation by the Kurnai people about the name that the electorate should be given. It wasn't accepted. Instead of Russell Broadbent recommended Monash, and so Monash
Russell
is...
Broadbent?
Yep, and a bunch of other people. At least it's not Macmillan anymore.
That's right.
At least.
Yeah. At the time, he said it would send a message of practical reconciliation. He explained recently it would send a message that we actually care about these issues, and if we're not responsible to our past, we don't understand our past, we can't get on with our future. The request has met with a mixed response. We might skip over that bit. It's finally happened. My journey to Gippsland to meet the descendants of the victims of my relative was a gesture too. I could not hope to undo the past. And yet to me, and I hope to those that I met, it was an extremely moving and meaningful experience, and one that left me with a better understanding of how such atrocities take place and how we might hope to repair the damage they leave behind. A courageous article and a courageous thing to do, to actually go and be attentively present to a very, very uncomfortable reality about yourself and your family. What are your responses?
I'd love to know what that meant to the Kurnai people.
Yeah, so would I. Yeah. I'd love to read that book. I haven't, it must be, it was published not long after that article, which that article was 2016, so Wikipedia, ironically, which is not usually used as a source at university level, I just hasten to add. Don't feel like you can get away with this in your essay. But Wikipedia actually has a short entry on Gippsland massacres, and all of it is sourced from reputable sources as far as we can make out. One of the books that we've got, which one was it? That one, Aboriginal Victorians, actually outlines and details the sources that this information comes from.
This is a tougher read than the other one.
Yeah, that's more
very academic.
But here you've got a list of what are thought to be the main incidences of violence, colonial violence against Indigenous peoples in Gippsland, up to 1850. There are recorded ones after 1850 as well.
There's a Slaughterhouse Creek one that's listed.
Mm.
In this book, they were actually mentioned by a woman called Bessie Yarran, who lives over in Sale, an Aboriginal woman involved in a lot of work over there,
Okay.
which is where some of the information in here was drawn from interviews with people over there.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So she mentioned the Warrable Creek and the Bodry River. She also mentioned Slaughterhouse Creek.
Okay.
But they tend to be, when it comes to official government documents, they tend to be questioned because of the sources. So oral history isn't kind of considered as powerful as, or as compelling evidence.
And it wasn't only the oral history that was the base of that, it was actually the status of Indigenous peoples in law, wasn't it? You read something this morning about the fact that Indigenous people, certainly Indigenous people who were not Christianised, were not actually recognised as persons in law, and so they couldn't give testify. They couldn't testify.
They were unable to swear on the Bible.
That's yeah.
So so there were certain exclusions before the law for the Aboriginal people, but it's also because none of these killings were government sanctioned, obviously. So they're not recorded except by private citizens who made commentary in letters or in journals. They wrote about the demise of Aboriginal communities and families and so on, and what they'd seen. And it has different level of standing in terms of evidence. Which is why the other book that you held for 18.
Oh, this one? Yeah, 1835.
Which is why that carries so much weight, because it's based on official government documents that you can still source in the library.
Yeah. And this quote by Henry Mayrick, who was an early settler in Gippsland, is extraordinary, and I'll just read that out for the benefit of our compatriots out there in internet land. Henry wrote, "The blacks are very quiet here now, poor wretches. No wild beast of the forest was ever hunted down with such unsparing perseverance as they are. Men, women and children are shot whenever they can be met with. I have protested against it at every station I have been in Gippsland, in the strongest language, but these things are kept very secret, as the penalty would certainly be hanging. For myself, if I caught a black actually killing my sheep, I would shoot him with as little remorse as I would a wild dog. But no consideration on earth would induce me to ride into a camp and fire on them indiscriminately, as is the custom whenever the smoke is seen. They, the Aborigines, will very shortly be extinct. It is impossible to say how many have been shot, but I am convinced that not less than 450 have been murdered altogether. Isn't it extraordinary hearing the context speaking? You know, so yeah, okay, it's fair enough to shoot someone if they're stealing your sheep, but you just don't go and massacre them indiscriminately. And also the assumption that they would soon be extinct, which is a widespread,
and the assumption that if someone was caught doing it, that they'd be hanged.
Yes.
And there is evidence that people were brought before courts for murders, and not sentenced to life, not hung, given a couple of months here or there for what they did. All that off on technicalities. So he's got such confidence in the law, which didn't support it anyway.
That's right.
The language is very similar to the Secret River.
Oh yes, yeah.
A thriving community that was massacred by the white settlers that lived along the Hawkesbury River. And the community would just, without soul from that point on, those who remained were pretty much mute and soulless from that point on.
Reading things like this makes you think about like other groups of Indigenous peoples today, and what can we learn about the past for present Indigenous groups in other countries whose lands are being taken or being killed today, and what can we learn from them to other Indigenous groups?
Absolutely, and Indigenous peoples from across the world, in particular Australian Indigenous, North American, Canadian Indigenous, South American Indigenous groups often gather together to share stories and but you're right.
Reminds me of the movie The Mission. And that's how really, really illustrates like not just like the South American Indigenous, but I think even like all Indigenous, how the white settlement affected.
Absolutely. The other element of this little bit of testimony that strikes me is that we're not only talking about the trauma of Indigenous peoples in this situation. The context of colonisation traumatised many, many people, including colonists who were part of it.
The other thing too that when you're talking about massacres, and one of the points made in this book is that the author talks about in this one is that in the initial years when squatters were pushing into Victoria, that it unsettled so many people that there was an escalation in kinship violence. Between nations, Aboriginal nations and groups, because people being displaced and ending up in other people's land, and there was an escalation. And he doesn't say it like this. I'm saying like this in terms of the psychosocial, spiritual space, kind of an escalation in anxiety and insecurity. So, because there was always particular laws about who could be killed under what circumstances around law. So, like if someone just indiscriminately murdered somebody, then that's got to be dealt with in a very specific way. But there's a point made in there that that initially Aboriginal people in Victoria didn't see the deaths and the murders as being the fault of settlers often. It was seen as to do with an imbalance of stranger people in the wrong places, spirit. Anyway, it's quite complex, it's quite interesting.
And the reason that Aboriginal people weren't recognised with personhood was so you could do that. You know, he said, if I saw a black killing my sheep, shooting with this little remorses, I would have walked off. There was a dehumanising in that, and there was an official dehumanising. You know, they weren't given voting rights. They weren't. They were not people. Therefore, in the same way as you would go out and have a bounty on dingo, you would have a bounty on Aboriginal people to keep them down. So because, and you know, I mean, I've read a document where somebody talked about baiting.
Yeah,
They
we can
baited.
see, one of the 16
But
poison.
they called it baiting.
Yeah.
You know, that's a very specific term that you use.
It is,
for
isn't it?
pest
Yeah,
animals.
yeah.
They called it baiting.
Yeah, it's that
Poisoning
convenient
them.
thing, isn't it? You know, like it was convenient to declare Australia terra nullius,
No people.
empty, no people, empty land.
And so you
Even
can
though it was a
kill them
blatant
because they're
lie.
not people.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll go and get a cuppa in a minute, and then we'll come back and watch this short film. But I just want us to touch on this sense of resilience, because we've heard that all expectations were that the Kurnai people would be just gone, completely gone. If it wasn't disease, it was people being stolen, it was people being killed, and the reduction in population was so drastic. And yet we've got some figures here that suggest resilience. They're extraordinary figures. Were you going to say something?
Can I just add from the counselling perspective, or spiritual care, that in terms of trauma and abuse, we were talking earlier about part of the national problem is Australia's denial of the depth of damage done. And so there's been an apology and sorry day and so on and so forth, but it hasn't. There's still a lot that hasn't been named yet. And there's kind of like, well, let's push over to the healing. Let's kind of jump into the healing because we don't want to face that because it's really painful. And we know that in the counselling and the spiritual care space that if people are unable to come face to face with that stuff at some point and let it be named, and move out of the denial space, that the healing doesn't really properly begin. And I suppose one of the things when we're talking about resilience, there's also a very strong movement in the counselling space around abuse where rather than people being called victims, so you'll often hear on television, the news, victims of crime, victim of abuse, victim of violence. But what we see right alongside resilience is the word survival, survivor. So there's at some point one of the most empowering things that I've seen and experienced is this sense of moving from a sense of being victim and powerless to being survivor, resilient and empowered to grow and heal. So there's a significant difference, and it might seem like just a shift in words, but that shift in words is very, very powerful for people's healing.
And I think that's what's at the core of Van der Kolk's work too, is that sense that whilst the trauma remains subconsciously embedded in your physiology, you are kind of a victim to it in an ongoing sense. But where you're enabled to gain proximity to the trauma, where it comes from, and actually then integrate it so that it becomes memory, true memory, then that's when the capacity to heal and to not be the victim to that takes place.
Yes, as part of that, being victim to or being beholden to or stuck or in that denial space, that what's the phrase? There's something about I'm going to have to come back to it.
That's all right.
I've lost the phrase. It just locks in there beautifully.
Yeah. Why don't we look at these figures and then it'll pop back in, I'm sure of it. So, what's the name of this guy again? The ANU academic. Can you remember his name? Booten.
Or Button.
They've taken. He's taken what's called plausible backcast figures. So, adding up all of the figures that we can actually kind of at least partially substantiate coming up with this figure of around about 800,000 population in Australia at landfall, colonial landfall. And this showing the trajectory of Australian population since, between 1788 and 1848. And don't worry, internet people, I'll put this up on ARC for you to see.
Actually 1850, but it only finishes that.
Okay, yeah, all right. So there you can see a comparison between Aboriginal and colonist populations between 1788 and 1850.
And the talk in relation to those figures, they talk about specific points in history where there's been outbreaks of various disease and then conflict, violence and so on.
So you can see there why, I mean, you know, you're looking at well under half a century and you've got a decline of 500,000 people, in overall population anyway.
300,000 just in the first 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And that doesn't include later people groups that were found that hadn't had connection with colonists. So there were no figures on.
Yeah, it's very, very hard to ascertain anything, you know, prior to the mid-1800s. But look at this, right? Look at this. The official Indigenous population estimates, 1901 to 2016. We're looking at just under 100,000 in 1901, and in 2016 we're looking at just under 800,000.
Which is where we started from back in 1788.
I don't know about you, but that tells a story of resilience, extraordinary resilience. And what in universities is called post-colonial agency, capacity to reclaim identity and presence.
In 1980, 81.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Yeah.
Certainly there was a shift that happened kind of around the end of last century where they started to implement things that started to move towards closing the health gap, or closing the gap, if you like. So things began to kind of shift in that time. I think the closing the health gap policies were brought in the new century under that title from memory. But that was the beginning of quite a lot of shifts. But what made the dip happen from 76 to 81 is not clear.
I'm wondering if there's a recognition factor in there. That around that time there was a shift. When was the Redfern's merge?
96, I think.
Around that time there was a growing recognition of the value of Aboriginal people.
So the Whitlam was kind of in the kind of late or mid
70.
Mid-70s,
Yeah,
wasn't it?
75.
So there was something
73.
happening around that and that shift and
And how many people didn't admit to being Aboriginal?
Yeah.
Because they didn't feel safe.
Yeah.
so
Or how many people
identification.
didn't actually know,
And how many people
right? Yeah.
found out?
Because so many had been.
I think it's a
Yeah.
I recently attended a lecture that was all about statistics and population because the Australian government only measures certain things that are easy to measure. Doesn't measure quality of life or well-being from the Indigenous perspective, but from a Western kind of imperialist kind of perspective. So certain measures around education and Year 12 and health indicators and so on and so forth, and definitely the identification of who are you. And people are still allowed to not identify identify and all those forms, but every time you go to hospital you're asked, are you Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin? So absolutely there'd be more identification as well with the census that happens each year.
Even like this is like a story of hope to be shared. Like I'm like in school and all done a lot of like Aboriginal stuff, like in schools now, a lot of that. But like I've never seen a graph like that actually shows the increase, and I think that is a story of hope to maybe more widely known that they have got that resilience to come back. It's not just that they're still struggling to come back because they're past. They are that they've got amazing resilience to continue that even while they keep processing.
And I think there are figures to suggest, aren't there, Kate, that most Indigenous Australians now live in cities and
on the eastern side,
on the eastern seaboard, and are educated business people. You know, so often the caricature we still often get in the press is of a victimised, brutalised, powerless people.
or people dancing.
Yeah, right. So there's still all kinds of
Culture is just the arts.
Stereotypes that we project onto Indigenous people, when in fact who they are is as diverse and vibrant and educated and full of agency in life as any other sector in the community.
Still playing catch up on.
We're still figuring
these
out.
It's important to recognise that these figures relate to numbers of people. It doesn't relate to regaining the life or the full agency over how we want to live. They're still straddling, like Cheryl said last week, still having to straddle, like being Aboriginal, living in a white-dominated kind of Western world. So there's still that straddling going on. So rather than just abandoning Aboriginality, it's an ownership of that and expanding to accommodate the world they're living in, which is an extraordinary story.
I picked up this little quote from Van der Kolk. There are many, many examples of Van der Kolk trying to articulate this throughout his book, as you know. And he's talking about a particular person in this case, but we can extrapolate that out to include others. So these episodes of trauma do not dominate existence. They are simply part of the ongoing, evolving story of life. And that's when trauma is enabled to become resilience and healing and so on. When somehow we're able to get close to it, pay attention to it, and incorporate it into our memory.
And that's what it was that I was trying to grab before. That so often when people have gone through traumatic events, I've heard people say, I don't want this to define me. Because they want to push it back and get it out of their lives and move on and get back to normal. But it's a kind of a denial of something that's actually part of your story now. You don't want to keep feeling a re-traumatising, you don't want to keep feeling the trauma, and you don't want to be controlled by it. But part of your story will be defined by that incident, because it will change your perspective. It will change the way that you engage with the world. It will change the way that you empathise and the way that you hear things. So it doesn't define your whole life, but it certainly might characterise a chapter.
And it will certainly, I think what Van der Kolk suggests is that if it's enabled to become part of your healthy memory, it will influence the way you decide to be in the future. But that's a healthy thing. That's what you want. That's the function of it for you, the life-giving function of it, as opposed to the paralysis
and
that
so
comes
going
about.
back to Cal, back over in the UK, who wrote that piece, she's related to Macmillan. She's been shocked. She's been trying to deal with that history. And it doesn't define who she is, but it's actually part of how she's engaging with the world and wanting to make a difference.
Absolutely. So that's a great example of post-traumatic resilience, isn't it, in that sense? We've been going now for an hour and a quarter, so let's break, have a cuppa, go to the loo, whatever you want to do, and then we'll come back and we'll watch this episode of First Australians, and that will will draw out and give depth and breadth to a lot of the things we've been talking about.